My wife changed the house locks and left me outside in the rain. She said I needed a lesson. I didn't argue. I just watched her close the windows and curtains. A black SUV pulled up moments later. My bodyguard stepped out. Calm and ready, I smiled as I climbed in. Her cruelty had ended. This was her last mistake. You know that moment when your whole life shifts on its axis and you can actually hear the universe laughing at you? Yeah, well, mine happened on a Tuesday night while I was getting absolutely drenched like some pathetic rom-com reject. Except there wasn't going to be any running through the airport reunion scene at the end of this disaster. The rain had started innocent enough, just a few drops that made me think, oh, how quaint, a little evening shower. But Mother Nature, apparently having the same sense of timing as my soon-to-be ex-wife, decided to turn those gentle drops into what I can only describe as God's own fire hose pointed directly at my already crumbling dignity. There I was, standing under her porch light in my best Armani suit, the one she bought me for our anniversary last year when she still pretended to give a damn, now looking like I'd gone 10 rounds with a washing machine and lost spectacularly. Through the frosted glass of our front door, I could see Bianca Morel, and yes, she insisted on keeping her maiden name, which should have been red flag number 1 in a parade of crimson warnings I'd somehow managed to miss, staring at me with the kind of cold calculation usually reserved for tax auditors and serial killers. She wasn't screaming, which honestly would have been preferable. Screaming would have meant emotion, passion, something resembling the woman I'd foolishly fallen for 5 years ago. Instead, she looked at me like I was a package delivered to the wrong address, an inconvenience that needed to be returned to sender with a polite but firm, no thank you. The sound that came next will probably haunt my dreams until I'm old and gray. Assuming I live that long after the stress-induced heart attack I'm surely heading for. Click. One simple, decisive sound that somehow managed to contain all the contempt and dismissal of our entire marriage. The deadbolt sliding home with the finality of a coffin lid closing. Then came the soft whisper of fabric as she drew the curtains, cutting off even the illusion of transparency between us, followed by the subtle click of the foyer lamp being switched off, plunging me into darkness, both literal and metaphorical. But here's the thing about Bianca. She never could resist getting the last word in, even when she was actively destroying what was left of our relationship. The intercom crackled to life, her voice coming through with that particular brand of icy superiority she'd perfected over the years, the tone she usually reserved for waiters who brought her the wrong wine or contractors who had the audacity to track mud through her pristine house. "Consider it a lesson, Adrian," she said, and I could practically hear the smirk in her voice. "You need to learn your place." Learn my place. Right. Because apparently, after 5 years of marriage, countless joint decisions, shared dreams, and what I'd naively thought was love, my place was outside in a torrential downpour while she played judge, jury, and executioner from the comfort of our climate-controlled entryway. The woman who used to trace patterns on my chest while we planned our future together was now lecturing me about hierarchy like I was some disobedient employee who'd forgotten to knock before entering the boss's office that I didn't knock. Call it pride, call it stubbornness, or call it the last remaining shreds of my self-respect. But I sure as hell wasn't going to stand there pounding on my own front door like some lovesick teenager trying to win back his high school girlfriend. I didn't beg either, though God knows part of me wanted to. The part that still remembered anniversary dinners and lazy Sunday mornings. The part that kept whispering maybe this was all just some terrible misunderstanding that could be fixed with the right words or the right gesture. Instead, I just stood there like an idiot, watching the silhouette of the woman I used to love. And yeah, that past tense hits like a punch to the gut. Fade behind those expensive linen drapes she'd special ordered from some boutique in the city. The same drapes she'd agonized over for weeks, making me look at approximately 17 different shades of white that all looked identical to my obviously inferior male eye. Now they were just another barrier between us, another symbol of how completely she'd written me out of the life we built together. But that's when the curb lights washed over the driveway with their cold, fluorescent judgment, followed by the low rumble of an engine that meant salvation was finally arriving. The black SUV rolled to a stop with the kind of quiet authority that only comes with German engineering and a price tag that would make most people weep, and out stepped Kate Ivers, my bodyguard, carrying an umbrella in one hand and his trademark composure in the other, like they were both just natural extensions of his being. Now, I know what you're thinking, bodyguard. Really? But when your software company starts pulling in 8 figures and you've got competitors who think industrial espionage is just another Tuesday, personal security stops being paranoia and starts being common sense. Plus, Cade wasn't just muscle. He was former military intelligence with a degree in computer science and the kind of analytical mind that could spot trouble 3 chess moves before it happened. If I was going to have someone watching my back, I wanted someone who could think as well as they could fight. "Ready when you are, sir," he said, and there wasn't a trace of judgment in his voice. No hint that he thought less of me for getting locked out of my own house like some deadbeat who'd forgotten to pay the rent. Just professional courtesy and the kind of steady reliability that was looking pretty damn attractive compared to the emotional minefield I'd been navigating at home, that I felt something that might have been a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Rain still running down my jaw like tears I was too proud or too numb to cry. Her cruelty just ended, I said, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I meant every word. Because standing there in that downpour, watching the last pretense of our marriage dissolve like sugar in the rain, I finally understood that this wasn't the end of my story. It was just the end of the chapter where I played the fool that I climbed into the SUV without looking back, because what was the point? Behind me was a house full of memories that had already started turning sour, a woman who'd made it crystal clear that I was no longer welcome in the life we'd supposedly built together, and 5 years of what I was beginning to realize might have been the longest con in history. Ahead of me was uncertainty, sure, but it was my uncertainty, my choice, my chance to figure out who Adrian Holt was when he wasn't busy being Bianca Morel's disappointing husband. As we pulled away from the curb, I caught a glimpse of something in the side mirror that made my smile widen into something that probably would have scared small children and insurance salesmen. The porch camera I'd installed 6 months ago, ostensibly to catch the wild raccoons that kept getting into our trash, but really because I'd started getting paranoid about the strange cars I'd been seeing in the neighborhood, turned its electronic eye toward the front door, red light blinking like a digital heartbeat, recording everything, every damn thing. The lockout, the rain, her voice on the intercom delivering her cruel little lesson, all of it captured in high definition, time-stamped, and automatically uploaded to a cloud storage account that Bianca didn't even know existed. She thought she was teaching me about my place in her world, but what she'd actually done was provide me with Exhibit A in what was about to become the most expensive education of her life. The inside of the SUV smelled like leather and discipline, which sounds like the setup for a really weird cologne commercial, but honestly described the kind of controlled environment I needed right about now. Cade handed me a towel that was somehow both perfectly dry and warm, because of course he'd thought to heat it, along with a jacket that looked suspiciously like it had been tailored specifically for moments when I'd need to make a quick wardrobe change after getting soaked by my own wife's betrayal. The man was either psychic or he'd been expecting this day for a while now. "Take the long route," I told him, wringing rainwater out of my hair like some soggy golden retriever. "I don't want to be seen on her street cams." See, here's the thing about living with someone who thinks surveillance is just another form of interior decorating. You learn to think 3 steps ahead about who's watching what and when. Bianca had installed more cameras around our neighborhood than the Pentagon, all in the name of security, but I'd started suspecting they were less about keeping intruders out and more about keeping track of my comings and goings. Call it paranoia, but when your wife starts treating you like a suspect in your own marriage, you develop a healthy respect for the power of recorded evidence. Cade nodded and took us through the kind of circuitous route that would make a GPS have a nervous breakdown, winding through side streets and residential areas where the only witnesses were lawn sprinklers and the occasional insomniac walking their dog. While he navigated us through suburbia's back channels, I pulled out my encrypted phone. Yeah, I had one of those now, because apparently my life had become the kind of thriller novel I used to mock, and checked the live backup feeds. The audio from the intercom was crystal clear, Bianca's voice coming through with all the warmth of a tax notice. The video from the porch showed me in all my rain-soaked glory, looking pathetic but also clearly non-threatening, clearly the victim rather than the aggressor. The timestamps were all there, everything uploading to a cloud storage system that existed in a legal gray area Bianca didn't know existed, managed by a security company she'd never heard of, paid for through an account she'd never seen. Primary safe location. Kate asked, because the man had a gift for asking exactly the right questions at exactly the right time. Not yet, I said, watching the upload progress bars creep toward completion like the world's slowest countdown to justice. Run the dry run. Those 3 words meant more than they sounded like to anyone who might have been listening. See, Kate and I had been planning for this moment for months now. Ever since Bianca's trial separations had started becoming a regular feature of our marital landscape. The vanishing jewelry that she claimed she'd donated to charity, but never had receipts for. The secret of late-night, bored dinners that somehow never appeared on any restaurant credit card statements. The way she'd started treating our joint accounts like her personal piggy bank, while simultaneously complaining that I wasn't contributing enough to the household expenses. After the 3rd time, she'd locked me out for my own reflection time. I'd made some calls. First to Priya Menon, a forensic accountant who could track money through more shell companies than a Russian oligarch, and who had the kind of attention to detail that would make an obsessive-compulsive librarian weep with joy. Then to Sloan Carter, a family law attorney who knew the judge rotation calendar by heart and had a reputation for turning divorce proceedings into precision military campaigns. Both women had the same reaction when I'd explained my situation, a kind of grim satisfaction that suggested they'd seen this particular movie before and knew exactly how it was going to end. The dry run we'd rehearsed involved everything from backup documentation to safe houses to communication protocols that would make the CIA proud. Tonight's lockout wasn't a surprise. It was the trigger we'd been waiting for, the moment when Bianca would finally cross the line from emotional manipulation into something that could be documented, witnessed, and presented to a judge who wouldn't be impressed by her designer clothes and practiced tears. An MY phone buzzed with an incoming message, and I felt that familiar spike of adrenaline that had become my body's default reaction to any form of electronic communication. But this time, it wasn't from Bianca or her flying monkeys. It was from Priya, and the message was exactly what I'd been both hoping for and dreading. Funds moved again. New shell. Same hand. I stared at the screen, feeling that cold knot in my stomach tighten another notch. She'd found another transfer, another piece of the puzzle that was slowly revealing the true scope of Bianca's creative accounting. This wasn't just about emotional cruelty or marital discord. This was about money, substantial amounts of it, being moved around like pieces on a chessboard by someone who thought she was playing against an amateur. The amount made my breath catch. $75,000, transferred out of our joint business line exactly 3 hours before Bianca had turned that deadbolt. 3 hours. Which meant she'd already made the decision to lock me out before I'd even left the office, before I'd sat in traffic thinking about what I was going to say to try to fix whatever was broken between us, before I'd stood under that porch light like an idiot hoping for some sign that the woman I'd married was still somewhere inside the stranger she'd become. But here's what really got me. The timing wasn't coincidental. She'd moved the money first, then executed the lockout, which meant this wasn't some spontaneous emotional reaction to whatever imaginary slight I'd committed this time. This was premeditated, calculated, designed to maximize both my humiliation and her financial advantage. She'd literally stolen from our joint account and then locked me out of our home on the same day, and she'd thought she was clever enough to get away with it. The shell company was new, Priya's message continued, but the signature patterns were identical to the others we'd been tracking. Ravenlith, LLC, registered in Delaware because of course it was, with a registered agent service that specialized in helping people hide money from inconvenient spouses. The same setup Julian Cross had been using for his consulting business, the same structure that had been quietly draining our accounts for months, while I'd been too busy trying to save our marriage to notice that she'd already ended it. I forwarded the information to Sloan with a message that was probably more profanity than professional communication, but at that point, I was past caring about maintaining my business-appropriate vocabulary. The woman had just stolen $75,000 and locked me out in a rainstorm, so forgive me if my language got a little colorful. Change of plans, I told Cade, watching the city lights blur past us like neon tears. Take us to the Fairmont Ellison, the downtown location, the one where they have security cameras in every hallway, doormen who remember faces, and a concierge who can notarize documents at midnight. I confirmed. I want every minute of tonight documented by someone other than us. Because if Bianca wanted to play games with evidence and documentation, she was about to learn that she'd picked a fight with someone who'd built his entire career on systems and contingencies. Every transfer, every shell company, every fake invoice and forged signature was going to come back to haunt her in ways she couldn't even imagine yet. The rain was still falling, but somehow it didn't feel cold anymore. Funny how the human brain works when you're sitting in the back of an SUV at midnight, watching your marriage dissolve in real time through encrypted phone notifications. Instead of focusing on the present disaster, the part where my wife just stole 75 grand and locked me out like some deadbeat roommate, my mind decided to take a lovely little trip down memory lane to show me exactly how spectacularly blind I'd been to the warning signs that were apparently flashing like Vegas neon for anyone with half a brain to see. It started 8 months ago with what I can only describe as financial inconsistencies, which sounds way more sophisticated than. My wife's numbers stopped adding up, and I was too whipped to call her on it. Bianca's boutique brand consulting firm, Morel Creative Solutions, because of course she'd named it after herself, had suddenly started booking premium suites at 5-star hotels for client strategy sessions, while our property taxes went mysteriously unpaid. And when I say mysteriously, I mean she claimed she'd forgotten to transfer the money from our business account, then claimed the bank had delayed the transfer, then claimed the county had lost the payment, cycling through excuses like a broken jukebox stuck on the greatest hits of financial gaslighting. But here's the thing about being married to someone for 5 years. You develop this unfortunate ability to know when they're lying even when you desperately want to believe them. The way Bianca's left eye twitched when she explained why we needed to take out a line of credit against the house. The way she suddenly became very interested in her phone whenever I asked about specific client invoices. The way she'd started having emergency client calls that required her to leave the room, usually right after I'd brought up anything related to our joint finances. I did what any rational person would do when their spouse starts acting like a character from a bad heist movie. I checked the server logs at my company, Holt Arcadia Systems. Because yes, I'm exactly that paranoid, and yes, I have exactly that level of access to systems that would make most people's privacy advocates weep. What I found made my stomach drop faster than a lead balloon at a physics convention. Email autoforwarders that I definitely hadn't set up, redirecting copies of all our financial correspondence to an account I'd never seen before. Every bank statement, every investment summary, every insurance document, every piece of financial information that came through our shared email was being quietly copied and sent to someone else. It was like discovering that your house had been bugged, except instead of audio surveillance, someone had been conducting financial reconnaissance on our entire life for months. The forwarding rules were sophisticated enough that I almost missed them, buried in the server architecture like digital termites slowly eating away at our privacy. But that's when I made the call to Priya Menon, and let me tell you, finding a forensic accountant who specializes in marital financial fraud is not the kind of Google search you ever want to be making. But Priya came recommended by 3 different divorce attorneys, had testimonials that read like reviews for a financial detective agency, and charged the kind of hourly rate that suggested she was very, very good at what she did. What she found made my blood pressure medication work overtime. The boutique invoices that Bianca claimed were for legitimate client work? They were being paid by Ravenlith, LLC, a Delaware shell company that existed primarily to move money around like a financial shell game. From there, the funds went to a payment processor in Nevada, because Nevada has the kind of banking privacy laws that would make Swiss bankers jealous, and then disappeared into a fintech company registered in Malta, which might as well have been Mars for all the transparency it offered. But here's where it got really interesting, in that, oh my God, my wife is actually a criminal mastermind kind of way. The names connected to these transactions all led back to Julian Cross, Bianca's so-called strategic partner and business mentor. Julian, who'd been coming to our dinner parties for 2 years. Julian, who'd been advising Bianca on scaling her business. Julian, who apparently had been helping her scale our marriage right out of our bank accounts and into his own private financial ecosystem, while Priya was tracing money through more corporate entities than a multinational tax avoidance scheme. I'd brought in Cade for what I diplomatically called a security upgrade. The beauty of having a bodyguard with a background in military intelligence is that when you tell him you're concerned about unauthorized access to your property, he doesn't ask a lot of inconvenient questions about why you suddenly need microcameras installed in the side alley and garage eaves. The surveillance equipment was basically invisible, tiny digital eyes that could record in high definition even in low light, with wireless transmission that uploaded everything to secure servers. Faster than Bianca could delete her browser history. We positioned them to capture the driveway, the side entrance she'd started using for her mysterious client meetings, and the garage where she'd been storing boxes that she claimed contained archived client files, but looked suspiciously like the kind of containers people use when they're preparing to relocate assets in a hurry. Meanwhile, Sloan Carter had been busy filing a sealed affidavit with the family court, documenting everything we'd discovered so far and establishing a legal timeline that would make it very difficult for Bianca to claim that her financial creativity was just a series of innocent accounting errors. Sloan had the kind of methodical approach to litigation that reminded me of watching a chess grandmaster plan 15 moves ahead, except instead of capturing pieces, she was capturing legal precedents and evidentiary foundations. The sealed affidavit was particularly brilliant because it meant that we had official court documentation of our suspicions weeks before Bianca made her move tonight. When this eventually got to trial, and at this point, it was definitely going to trial, we'd be able to demonstrate that her lockout wasn't an emotional reaction, but part of a pattern of escalating financial and emotional abuse that we'd been documenting for months. We were patient, which sounds almost Buddhist until you realize that patience in this context meant sitting on evidence of what was probably felony-level financial fraud, while watching your wife continue to steal from you with the kind of brazen confidence that suggested she thought I was too stupid or too whipped to notice. Every fake invoice, every mysterious transfer, every lie about where the money was going, we documented it all with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that would have impressed the IRS. That my phone pinged again with another update from Priya, and this one made me actually laugh out loud, which probably wasn't the healthiest reaction to discovering that your spouse had been systematically robbing you blind. But at that point, my emotional calibration was completely shot. Her spreadsheet showed the full scope of what she'd found. $310,000 total, siphoned over 5 months through a network of shell companies and fraudulent invoices that would have been impressive if it weren't being used to destroy my life. But here's what really got me. The pattern analysis suggested this wasn't just theft, it was asset flight preparation. The timing of the transfers, the destinations of the funds, the way the amounts had been increasing over time, it all pointed to someone who was planning to disappear with as much money as they could grab, leaving behind nothing but empty accounts, and a very confused husband who'd probably spend years trying to figure out what had happened to his life. Well, surprise, Bianca. Your very confused husband had figured it out 8 months early, and he'd been taking notes. You know what's funny about getting screwed over by your wife? The moment you stop being the victim and start being the guy with a plan, everything suddenly becomes crystal clear, like switching from standard definition to 4K. All those blurry details that you'd been squinting at for months suddenly snap into sharp, beautiful, prosecutable focus. The Fairmont Ellison at midnight looked like the kind of place where people with serious money went to make serious problems disappear, which was absolutely perfect for what I needed. Cade pulled up to the valet station, and I have to give the kid credit. He didn't even blink when a soaking wet businessman climbed out of a black SUV at the witching hour carrying nothing but a towel and the kind of smile that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. Inside, the lobby was all marble and understated elegance, the kind of place that charged you $300 a night just for the privilege of existing in the same space as their thread count. The front desk clerk was this perfectly put-together woman named Jennifer. Her name tag was gold-plated because of course it was, who looked at my damp hair and rumpled jacket and somehow managed to maintain the kind of professional courtesy that probably cost more than most people's cars. I need a suite under the name Adrian Luca, I told her, sliding over the credit card that was tied to a trust account Bianca didn't know existed. Because here's a pro tip for anyone who thinks their marriage might be heading for litigation. Always have a financial escape hatch that your spouse can't access. preferably one that's been legally established long enough that it can't be accused of being a response to marital problems. That Jennifer's fingers flew over her keyboard with the kind of efficiency that suggested she was used to handling unusual requests from unusual people at unusual hours. Of course, Mr. Luca. Will this be for business or pleasure? Business, I said, and I wasn't lying. The business of documenting exactly how my wife had tried to destroy my life, complete with timestamps and witness statements and enough video evidence to make the prosecution's case file look like a Michael Bay movie. The suite was ridiculous. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a living room bigger than most people's apartments, and a marble bathroom that probably cost more than my first car. But what really mattered was the hotel's reputation for discretion, their security camera coverage of every hallway and elevator, and the kind of detailed electronic records that would make it very clear exactly when I'd arrived and exactly what condition I'd been in. I set up my laptop on the enormous dining table and started recording a video statement, because apparently my life had become the kind of legal thriller where the protagonist has to create his own evidence in real time. The camera captured everything: my still damp hair, the timestamp showing 12:47 a.m., the weather report playing on the TV in the background confirming the severe thunderstorm warning that had been in effect when Bianca decided to lock me out. "This is Adrian Holt," I said to the camera, trying to sound professional instead of like a guy who'd just discovered that his wife was basically a white-collar criminal with really good taste in shoes. On September 15th at approximately 11:30 p.m., I arrived at my marital residence at 1247 Oakwood Drive to find that my wife, Bianca Morel, had changed the locks and refused me entry during severe weather conditions. I went through the whole sequence: the rain, the intercom conversation, the deliberate cruelty of turning off the lights and drawing the curtains while I stood there getting soaked like some pathetic extra in a rom-com where the romantic leads were replaced by a sociopath and her increasingly suspicious husband. I made sure to emphasize that I hadn't tried to force entry, hadn't raised my voice, hadn't done anything that could be construed as threatening or aggressive. While I was talking to the camera, Cade was busy syncing footage from every device we had: the porch camera, the Ring intercom, the dash cam from the SUV that showed our arrival and departure times. Everything time-stamped, everything uploaded to secure servers, everything building a digital paper trail that would be very difficult for Bianca's inevitable team of expensive lawyers to explain away. My phone started buzzing like an angry wasp, and I almost ignored it until I saw who was calling. Bianca. Because of course she was calling now, probably to deliver some follow-up lecture about my place in her carefully orchestrated life, or maybe to offer me the chance to apologize for whatever imaginary offense had triggered tonight's performance that I let it go to voicemail, because I was done playing her games on her terms. If she wanted to communicate, she could do it through lawyers like a civilized person, instead of through midnight lockouts and psychological warfare campaigns designed to make me feel like the problem in our relationship. But the calls didn't stop. First Bianca, then her mother Clarice, who was basically Bianca with 30 more years of practice at being absolutely terrible to people she considered beneath her. Clarice had never approved of me. I was too middle class, too ordinary, too much of a self-made man instead of the kind of inherited wealth aristocrat she thought her precious daughter deserved. The fact that I'd built a successful software company from nothing apparently counted for less than my tragic lack of a trust fund and a summer house in the Hamptons. The voicemail from Clarice was exactly what I expected. "Adrian, darling, don't make this more embarrassing than it needs to be. Find yourself a nice hotel and let Bianca have some space to think. You know how emotional she gets when she's under pressure." Emotional, right? Because systematic financial fraud was just what happened when delicate flowers like Bianca got a little stressed out. I added the voicemail to my evidence file, because apparently even my mother-in-law was going to be providing prosecution exhibits in the case against her daughter. But the real cherry on top of this whole disaster Sunday came in a text from Sloan that made me actually pump my fist in the air like some kind of legal victory touchdown. Judge Arya Patel just rotated on emergency docket. 11 a.m. hearing is possible if we file by 7 a.m. bring recordings. Judge Patel, if I believed in divine intervention, I'd say someone upstairs was finally paying attention to my situation. Arya Patel had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when it came to domestic financial abuse, particularly cases where one spouse tried to use housing security as a weapon against the other. She'd written opinions that had become required reading in family law courses, and her courtroom was where manipulative spouses went to discover that their emotional terrorism tactics didn't work on someone who'd seen every variation of marital cruelty that human creativity could devise. 7 a.m. filing deadline meant no sleep. But honestly, who needed sleep when you had adrenaline and the prospect of watching your wife's financial house of cards collapse in front of a judge who specialized in seeing through exactly the kind of performance art that Bianca had turned into her signature move? I opened my laptop and started typing. Time to turn 8 months of patience and documentation into the kind of legal filing that would make Bianca's expensive lawyers earn every penny of their billable hours. The rain was still falling outside, but inside my overpriced hotel suite, surrounded by evidence and legal documents and the satisfying glow of security camera footage, I felt warmer than I had in months. There's something almost religious about courthouse marble at 10:30 in the morning. All that cold, polished stone that's witnessed decades of human drama, echoing with the footsteps of people whose lives are about to change forever. The Montgomery County Family Court building looked like a temple dedicated to the god of legal consequences, and I was about to make an offering of evidence that would either vindicate 8 months of careful planning or confirm that I was a paranoid husband who'd lost his damn mind. The air conditioning was cranked to Arctic levels, which seemed fitting since I was about to find out whether justice really was blind or just suffering from selective vision when it came to attractive women who could cry on command. My breath was visible in little puffs as I walked through the security checkpoint, carrying a briefcase full of documentation that represented the difference between financial survival and complete ruin. Then I saw her, and honestly, if I hadn't known better, I might have thought I was looking at the victim instead of the perpetrator. Bianca arrived in a white trench coat that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, looking like she'd stepped off the pages of a magazine about successful women who definitely weren't criminal masterminds systematically robbing their husbands blind. Her hair was perfect, her makeup was flawless, and she had that particular expression of wounded dignity that she'd perfected over the years. Part confusion, part hurt, all calculated to make anyone watching think she was the injured party in whatever misunderstanding had brought us to this unfortunate moment. Walking beside her was Rogan Flint, and if Central Casting had been asked to provide the perfect example of a sleazy defense attorney, they couldn't have done better. Rogan was the kind of lawyer who loved cameras more than clients, who measured success by how many times his picture appeared in the legal journals rather than how many cases he actually won. He had that artificial tan that suggested too much time under UV lights, teeth so white they probably required sunglasses to look at directly, and a smile that made used car salesmen look trustworthy by comparison. The guy practically oozed the kind of confidence that came from never having met a truth he couldn't spin into something more favorable for his client. I'd done my research on him. 3 wives, 2 bankruptcy filings, and a disciplinary record with the state bar that read like a greatest hits collection of ethical violations that he'd managed to negotiate down to administrative warnings. Perfect choice for someone who needed legal representation for activities that existed in the gray area between creative accounting and outright fraud. Judge Arya Patel took the bench at exactly 11 a.m., and the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop another 10 degrees. She was the kind of woman who could silence a room just by walking into it, not because she was loud or dramatic, but because she radiated the kind of quiet authority that made it clear she'd heard every lie, seen every manipulation tactic, and developed a finely tuned bullshit detector that could spot deception from across the county. Sloan stood up with the kind of surgical precision that reminded me why I'd hired her, moving with the confident efficiency of someone who'd done this dance 1,000 times and knew exactly which steps would lead to victory. She was carrying a leather portfolio that contained 8 months of detective work, financial analysis, and video evidence, organized with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that would make Marie Kondo weep with joy. "Your Honor," Sloan began, her voice carrying just the right combination of respect and righteous indignation. "We're here today because of a pattern of escalating domestic financial abuse that culminated last night in my client being locked out of his marital home during a severe thunderstorm." She submitted our evidence package like she was dealing cards in a high-stakes poker game. First, the video of the lockout that showed me standing in the rain looking like a drowned rat, while Bianca's silhouette watched from behind glass, like I was some kind of unwanted solicitor. Then the intercom audio that captured her voice delivering her little lesson about my place in her world with all the warmth of a tax audit notification. Next came Priya's forensic memo, a masterpiece of financial detective work that traced $310,000 through more shell companies than a Russian oligarch's money laundering operation, complete with bank records, wire transfer documentation, and a timeline that showed the pattern of escalating theft. And finally, the security exhibit list showing all the property that Bianca had quietly moved into a storage unit under the Ravenlith corporate name 2 nights earlier, including antiques, artwork, and jewelry that she'd been claiming were temporarily stored for insurance purposes. Rogan jumped up like a jack-in-the-box powered by expensive coffee and questionable ethics, ready to deliver what I was sure would be a performance worthy of community theater. Your Honor, this is clearly a marital dispute that's been blown out of proportion. My client and Mr. Holt have been experiencing some difficulties, yes, but this is a voluntary separation, a mutual agreement to spend some time apart while they work through their differences. Any suggestion of financial impropriety is a misunderstanding based on my client's legitimate business activities. He gestured toward Bianca like he was presenting evidence of sainthood, and she responded with a look of confused hurt that would have been convincing if I hadn't lived with her for 5 years and learned to recognize when she was performing for an audience. The slight tilt of her head, the way she let her lower lip tremble just enough to suggest vulnerability without actually appearing weak. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. This is simply a case of a husband who refuses to accept that his wife has her own successful business ventures, Rogan continued, warming up to his theme like a preacher getting ready to pass the collection plate. Mr. Holt has become increasingly controlling and paranoid, to the point where he's hired investigators to spy on his own wife's legitimate business activities. Sloan let him finish his little speech, then stood up with the kind of smile that probably made opposing counsel break out in cold sweats. Your Honor, if I may. She pressed a button on her laptop, and suddenly the courtroom was filled with Bianca's voice from the intercom recording. Consider it a lesson, Adrian. You need to learn your place. The words hung in the air like toxic fog, and I watched Bianca's face go through approximately 7 different expressions in the span of 3 seconds before settling on what I can only describe as the look of someone who just realized they'd been caught red-handed with their fingers in the cookie jar. Except the cookies were worth several $100,000, and the jar belonged to someone else. That's when 2 men in dark suits stepped into the back of the courtroom, and every head in the room turned toward them like they were magnetic north. Bank compliance officers, carrying a sealed envelope that probably contained the kind of documentation that would make Rogan's expensive tan look even more artificial than usual. Judge Patel noticed them immediately, because judges develop the same kind of radar for important developments that predators develop for wounded prey. She glanced at the envelope, then at Bianca, then at Rogan, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head as she calculated exactly how much more complicated this case had just become. We'll get to you shortly, gentlemen, she said, and somehow those 6 words managed to contain more ominous promise than most people could pack into an entire threatening letter. I looked over at Bianca and saw something I'd never seen before in all our years together. Actual fear. There's a moment in every courtroom drama where the defendant realizes they're not the protagonist of their own story anymore. They're the cautionary tale everyone else will be talking about at dinner parties for the next decade. Watching Bianca's face as I took the witness stand was like watching someone discover that gravity still applied to them even when they really didn't want it to. Judge Patel had this way of looking at witnesses that made you feel like she could see straight through your skull into whatever neurons were firing back there, sorting truth from fiction with the efficiency of a human lie detector. When she asked me to explain the sequence of events from last night, I kept my voice steady and factual, because the last thing I needed was to sound like some bitter husband seeking revenge instead of a victim seeking justice. Your Honor, I arrived home at approximately 11:30 p.m. after working late at my office. I began, focusing on the facts instead of the emotional train wreck those facts represented. It was raining heavily. There was a severe thunderstorm warning in effect, which is documented in the weather service records we've submitted. When I approached the front door, I could see my wife through the glass. She was watching me, but she didn't open the door. I described the intercom conversation, the deliberate cruelty of the lights being turned off, the sound of the deadbolt sliding home like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. I explained that I hadn't tried to force entry, hadn't raised my voice, hadn't done anything that could be construed as threatening or aggressive. I was just a guy who'd been locked out of his own house during a storm by someone who'd apparently forgotten that marriage was supposed to be a partnership, not a dictatorship. The beauty of having 8 months of preparation was that I didn't have to rely on emotion or theatrics. I just had to recite facts that were supported by more documentation than most corporate mergers. Every statement I made could be verified by video evidence, audio recordings, or digital timestamps that didn't care about anyone's feelings or sob stories. When Sloan finished with my direct examination, Rogan stood up for cross-examination looking like a man who'd been asked to perform surgery with a butter knife. He tried to paint me as controlling, paranoid, someone who'd become obsessed with monitoring his wife's every move. But every question he asked just gave me another opportunity to explain exactly why that monitoring had been necessary, and exactly what it had revealed about the woman he was trying to portray as an innocent victim of my suspicious nature. "Mr. Holt, isn't it true that you installed surveillance equipment without your wife's knowledge?" "Yes," I said, because honesty was going to serve me a lot better than creative interpretation at this point. After discovering that someone had been redirecting our financial correspondence to an unauthorized email account, I became concerned about security breaches and installed cameras to monitor access to our property. "And you hired a forensic accountant to investigate your wife's business activities?" "I hired a forensic accountant to investigate unexplained financial transactions that were occurring in accounts that I was legally entitled to monitor as a joint account holder," I corrected. The fact that those transactions involved my wife's business activities was something we discovered during the investigation, not the reason for starting it. Each answer was like watching Rogan dig his own grave with increasingly desperate questions, and I could see Judge Patel taking notes with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was already planning her ruling. Then it was Priya's turn to take the stand, and if I thought my testimony was devastating, watching her walk the court through the financial evidence was like witnessing a masterpiece of forensic accounting artistry. She had charts, graphs, flowcharts showing the movement of money through various corporate entities, all presented with the kind of calm professionalism that made complex financial fraud look as clear and obvious as a children's picture book. "The pattern we see here is consistent with what we call dissipation of marital assets," she explained, pointing to a timeline that showed the escalating transfers over the past 5 months. "The amounts increase over time, the destinations become increasingly opaque, and the timing corresponds with documented periods of marital conflict." She traced the money from our joint business account to Ravenlith, LLC, then through the Nevada payment processor to the Malta fintech company, then to a series of cryptocurrency exchanges that made the whole operation look like something designed by someone who'd studied money laundering techniques as a hobby. The total amount, $310,000, represented nearly a third of our liquid assets, moved without my knowledge or consent through a network of shell companies that existed for no apparent purpose other than to hide money from inconvenient spouses. But the real bombshell came when she explained the timing correlation with Julian Cross's travel schedule. Every major transfer coincided with Julian's documented visits to our city, creating a pattern that suggested coordination between his consulting business and Bianca's creative accounting practices. It wasn't just theft. It was conspiracy. That Rogan's cross-examination of Priya was like watching someone try to argue with a calculator. Every question he asked just gave her another opportunity to explain exactly how the financial shell game had been constructed and exactly why it constituted clear evidence of fraudulent transfer of marital assets. By the time she finished, even Bianca was looking at her own lawyer like she was wondering if she should have invested in someone who actually understood how numbers worked. That's when the bank compliance officers finally got their moment in the spotlight, and the sealed envelope they delivered contained exactly the kind of documentation that turns civil disputes into criminal investigations. The unusual activity report showed not just the Ravenlith transfers we'd already documented, but a whole additional layer of financial creativity that even Priya hadn't discovered yet. Apparently, Bianca had also used forged board consent documents to draw a line of credit against my company's shares, essentially borrowing money against assets I owned to fund her disappearing act. The bank's fraud detection algorithms had flagged the transactions because the signature verification didn't match their samples, and they'd been conducting their own investigation for the past 2 weeks. But wait, there's more, and I mean that in the most sarcastic possible way, because apparently my wife's criminal creativity had no bounds. My phone started lighting up during the recess with messages from numbers I didn't recognize, and when I checked them, I discovered they were from people who worked at Bianca's firm. Not just current employees, but former ones who'd apparently been waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions about what was really going on at Morel Creative Solutions. The messages were like opening a dam of workplace dysfunction, vendor kickbacks being funneled through the boutique into Julian's private equity fund, duplicate invoices for services that had never been performed, a client entertainment budget that looked suspiciously like a personal luxury fund for Bianca, and Julian's romantic getaways disguised as business travel. One message in particular made my blood pressure medication work overtime. A junior associate who'd been fired 3 months ago for asking too many questions had copies of emails showing that Clarice, Bianca's charming mother, had pledged our lake house as collateral for something called Bianca's scale-up funding, which translated from rich person speak meant she'd used our vacation property to guarantee loans that were being used to fund her asset hiding operation. When court reconvened and Judge Patel delivered her ruling, her voice had the kind of cold finality that suggested she'd seen enough evidence to make her decision and wasn't particularly interested in hearing any more creative explanations from Rogan about misunderstandings and marital disputes. Exclusive use of the marital home, granted to me. Temporary spousal support. Bianca would be paying me, not the other way around, pending final asset equalization. Complete asset freeze on all accounts connected to Ravenlith or any other shell companies. And a no-harassment order that specifically noted the weather lockout as evidence of coercive control designed to inflict emotional distress. Bianca's face went through more expressions than a mime having an existential crisis, but the one that stuck was pure, undiluted shock. Apparently, she'd actually believed that her performance would be enough to convince a judge that she was the victim in this whole mess. As we walked out of the courthouse, I realized that what had started as a marriage dispute had officially become something much bigger, much more complex, and much more likely to end with criminal charges that would make her current legal problems look like parking tickets. You know what they say about pulling threads? Sometimes you think you're just fixing a loose button, and then suddenly you're holding the entire fabric of someone's lies in your hands, wondering how the hell they managed to weave such an elaborate tapestry of deception without you noticing. What had started as my personal domestic nightmare was morphing into something that would probably end up as a case study in white-collar crime courses, assuming any of us lived through the experience with our sanity intact. The first sign that this thing had grown legs and started running came when Julian Cross disappeared from social media, like he'd been raptured by the god of fraudulent consulting. His LinkedIn profile went dark, his company website suddenly displayed a temporarily under maintenance message, and his Twitter account, which had been posting daily motivational quotes about entrepreneurial success just a week earlier, vanished into the digital equivalent of witness protection. When someone who's built their entire brand around being visible suddenly decides they need to be invisible, it's usually because they've figured out that visibility is about to become a liability. Priya, armed with Sloane's subpoenas like a forensic accountant version of a medieval knight with a really sharp sword, started unraveling what we'd thought was just a marital asset dissipation scheme and discovered it was actually the tip of an iceberg that could have sunk the Titanic twice. The vendor kickbacks weren't just about skimming money from Bianca's boutique. They were part of a systematic fraud operation that involved fake contractors, duplicate invoicing, and a client entertainment budget that looked less like legitimate business expenses and more like a luxury lifestyle funded by other people's money. But here's where it got really ugly. In that special way that makes you lose faith in humanity and start wondering if maybe living in a cabin in the woods isn't such a bad idea after all. The fake contractors weren't just phantom employees created to inflate expenses. They were real people who'd been hired to perform actual work, except the work they were doing had nothing to do with brand consulting and everything to do with moving money around in ways that would make money laundering operations jealous of the creativity involved. My phone started buzzing with messages from people I'd never heard of, former employees of Morel Creative Solutions who'd apparently been waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions about what was really going on behind the scenes of Bianca's supposedly legitimate business empire. These weren't disgruntled workers looking to cause trouble. These were people who'd left the company because they'd started asking questions about invoice discrepancies and been told that their curiosity wasn't appreciated. The stories they told made my stomach churn like a washing machine full of concrete. Ghost contractors who existed only on paper but somehow managed to bill thousands of dollars for services that were never performed. Duplicate invoices that charged clients twice for the same work, with the extra payments disappearing into accounts that had nothing to do with the actual business operations. A client entertainment budget that seemed to consist primarily of romantic getaways to European cities, luxury shopping sprees, and expensive dinners at restaurants that charged more for appetizers than most people spend on groceries. But the part that really made my blood boil was discovering what Bianca and Julian had been doing to our elderly clients. The same investors I'd personally brought into our business relationships, people who trusted us because I'd vouched for our integrity and professionalism. They'd been targeting these clients specifically, offering them brand revival consulting services that promised to help their businesses adapt to modern marketing strategies, then systematically extracting consulting fees that got routed through Ravenlith instead of being used for any actual consulting work. Mrs. Okafor, our 73-year-old neighbor who'd always been like a surrogate grandmother to me, came forward with documentation that made me want to punch something expensive and breakable. She'd signed what she thought was a simple consultation agreement to help her small online crafts business expand its social media presence. But what she'd actually signed was authorization for automatic monthly withdrawals from her savings account that had been bleeding her retirement funds for 6 months. The consultation work she'd paid for. Complete fiction. No social media strategy, no brand development, no marketing materials. Just monthly bills for services that existed only in the imagination of someone who'd apparently decided that elderly people were easy targets for sophisticated theft disguised as business consulting. Mrs. Okafor had lost almost $15,000 of her fixed income savings to pay for consulting work that consisted primarily of Julian and Bianca using her money to fund their lifestyle, while occasionally sending her generic marketing advice that they'd probably copy-pasted from free online resources. When we added Mrs. Okafor's affidavit to our growing collection of evidence, something interesting happened. The district attorney's financial crimes unit started paying attention to our little marital dispute. Apparently, when you start documenting systematic fraud targeting elderly victims, it stops being a civil matter and starts being the kind of criminal enterprise that attracts the attention of people who have badges and the authority to make arrests. The phone call from Detective Sarah Chun was almost anticlimactic after everything else we'd discovered. She explained that they'd been tracking similar patterns in other cases. Elderly victims being targeted by fake consulting businesses that existed primarily to extract money through fraudulent contracts, with the funds being moved through shell companies to make them difficult to trace. Our documentation wasn't just evidence of marital asset dissipation anymore. It was evidence of a criminal enterprise that had been operating for years. That's when my phone buzzed with a message that made every other revelation seem like a warm-up act for the main event. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but the message was clear enough. Meet me. I can trade Bianca for immunity. Julian. I stared at the screen like it was going to suddenly start making more sense if I just concentrated hard enough. Julian Cross, who'd been ghosting social media and apparently preparing to flee the country, was now trying to negotiate his way out of criminal charges by offering to testify against his co-conspirator. The same Julian who'd been Bianca's mentor, strategic partner, and apparently romantic interest, was now ready to throw her under the bus to save his own skin. Cade, who'd been monitoring all our communications with the kind of professional paranoia that had kept me alive through this whole mess, managed to trace the message signal to a location that made perfect sense for someone who was trying to avoid detection while still maintaining the ability to disappear quickly if negotiations went badly. Downtown train station lockers, the kind of place where people left things they didn't want found, or met people they didn't want to be seen with. The location was classic spy novel territory. Public enough that it would be difficult to stage an ambush, but private enough that sensitive conversations could be conducted without attracting unwanted attention. Train stations were perfect for people who needed to maintain the option of rapid departure, with multiple exits and transportation options that could get you out of the city in any direction within minutes of deciding that staying was no longer a viable option. I forwarded Julian's message to Sloan with a note that probably contained more creative profanity than was strictly professional, but at that point, maintaining polite language seemed less important than figuring out how to handle a situation that had evolved from marital dispute to criminal conspiracy to whatever you call it when one of the co-conspirators decides to become a government witness in exchange for a reduced sentence. The irony wasn't lost on me that the man who'd been helping my wife steal from me was now offering to help me prove that she'd been stealing from me, presumably in exchange for the government's promise not to send him to prison for the kind of duration that would give him plenty of time to contemplate the career choices that had led him to this moment. Justice, apparently, had a sense of humor that was almost as twisted as my marriage had been. There's something deeply unsettling about sitting across from someone who helped destroy your life while they try to negotiate their way out of the consequences by offering to help you put the pieces back together. The interview room at the district attorney's office looked like every cop show interrogation scene you've ever seen. Gray walls, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they were dying of some wasting disease, and that particular institutional smell that suggested disinfectant fighting a losing battle against decades of human desperation. Julian Cross looked nothing like the smooth, confident business mentor who'd been coming to our dinner parties for 2 years, charming everyone with stories about his entrepreneurial success, while apparently taking mental notes about which of our friends might make good targets for his next financial scam. The man sitting across from me looked like he'd spent the past week sleeping in his car and living off gas station coffee, which might not have been far from the truth considering that his social media disappearance had probably coincided with the realization that federal investigators don't typically send friendly reminder emails before they start making arrests. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his usually perfect hair looked like he'd been running his hands through it for hours, and he had the kind of hollow-eyed expression that comes from finally understanding that all your clever schemes have a built-in expiration date, and yours just went off like a smoke detector in the middle of the night. When people talk about someone looking like they've run out of doors to run through, Julian was Exhibit A in that particular human condition, but he'd come prepared, which I had to give him credit for, even though his preparation was probably motivated more by self-preservation than any sudden attack of conscience. He brought thumb drives, multiple ones, organized with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that suggested he'd been planning this moment for longer than he wanted to admit. Internal emails between him and Bianca that laid out their entire operation like a how-to manual for spousal financial fraud. WhatsApp conversations that showed them discussing me like I was some kind of useful idiot who could be manipulated indefinitely as long as they were careful not to get too greedy too quickly. The videos from their shared loft were probably the most damaging evidence I'd ever seen, and I'd been collecting damaging evidence like it was a hobby for the past 8 months. Bianca, in her own words, explaining how she planned to maximize asset extraction before initiating divorce proceedings that would leave me with whatever scraps she decided weren't worth the effort of stealing. Julian coaching her on timing, on emotional manipulation techniques, on how to make me feel like the problems in our marriage were my fault, so I'd be too busy trying to fix myself to notice that they were systematically looting our joint accounts. But the real bombshell was the documentation of Bianca's exit strategy, which apparently involved more than just disappearing with our money. She'd been planning to disappear entirely. Julian had copies of correspondence with what he described as an investment immigration consultant, who specialized in helping wealthy individuals obtain second passports through various Caribbean and European programs that were apparently designed for people who had more money than patience for traditional immigration processes. Madeira, Portugal, specifically. Because apparently when you're planning to flee the country with several $100,000 in stolen assets, you want to do it somewhere with good weather, excellent wine, and extradition treaties that are complicated enough to give your lawyers something to argue about for years. Bianca had been working on obtaining Portuguese citizenship through their investment program, which required a substantial financial commitment but offered the kind of mobility that would make it very difficult for American law enforcement to drag you back for trial. Sloan had structured Julian's proffer agreement with the kind of precision that would have made contract lawyers weep with professional admiration. Partial immunity in exchange for documented cooperation, with specific performance requirements that would ensure he couldn't just disappear after providing minimal assistance. He had to testify truthfully in any criminal proceedings, provide complete access to all financial records related to the fraud operation, and assist in the recovery of stolen assets regardless of where they'd been hidden or how many shell companies were involved in concealing them. The DA's office moved fast once they had Julian's cooperation, which I guess is what happens when you hand prosecutors a complete roadmap to a criminal enterprise along with video evidence of the defendants, discussing their crimes like they were planning a vacation. Within 48 hours, warrants had been issued not just for Bianca's arrest, but for seizure of assets, search of properties, and freezing of accounts connected to the entire Ravenlith network. They found Bianca at Clarice's townhouse, which wasn't exactly a surprise since her mother had been enabling her criminal behavior from the beginning and probably thought she was helping her daughter escape the consequences of what they'd convinced themselves was just marital discord rather than systematic fraud. What was a surprise was how prepared she was for this moment. Suitcase packed, travel documents organized, plane tickets printed for a flight that would have gotten her to Lisbon with connections to Madeira, all scheduled for the next morning. She wasn't hiding, exactly, but she wasn't planning to stick around for the legal consequences of her creative accounting either. The suitcase contained enough clothes for an extended stay, along with jewelry, cash, and electronic devices that probably contained additional evidence of the fraud operation. The travel documents included not just her regular U.S. passport, but preliminary paperwork for Portuguese residency that suggested this escape plan had been in development for months, if not longer. When they arrested her, Bianca didn't look surprised. She looked offended, like someone had interrupted her carefully planned dinner party with an unexpected emergency that was inconvenient but not particularly threatening. She submitted to the handcuffs with the kind of dignified resignation that suggested she'd been expecting this moment and had already mentally prepared her defense strategy, which would probably involve portraying herself as a misunderstood entrepreneur whose business practices had been misinterpreted by people who didn't understand the complexities of modern financial consulting. But as they walked her toward the police car, she turned to look at me with an expression that contained more concentrated venom than a snake farm, and delivered what was probably meant to be her final devastating blow to my already shattered sense of self-worth. You always needed rescuing, Adrian. Now who are you without me? It was meant to be cruel, designed to make me question whether I'd ever been capable of functioning as an independent human being, whether my success had been dependent on her support and guidance, whether pursuing justice against her was just another example of my inability to handle problems without someone else's help. The same psychological manipulation tactics she'd been using throughout our marriage, deployed one final time in the hopes of making me doubt myself enough to back down from pressing charges that I didn't answer her, because honestly, what was the point? Judge Patel would be providing the answer soon enough, along with a jury of 12 people who would get to decide whether Bianca's version of reality bore any resemblance to the documented facts of what she'd actually done. The woman who'd spent years convincing me that I was inadequate, that I needed her guidance to navigate the complexities of adult life, was about to discover that the legal system wasn't particularly impressed by her manipulation techniques. As the police car pulled away, I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't wondering what Bianca thought about my decisions or whether I was handling things the right way. I was just watching justice finally start to catch up with someone who'd spent too long believing that consequences were for other people. You know what's weird about surviving something that was designed to destroy you? The moment you realize you're not just going to make it through, you're going to make it mean something. Standing in the empty warehouse space that would eventually become Harbor House, surrounded by construction dust and the smell of fresh possibility, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The kind of bone-deep satisfaction that comes from turning your worst nightmare into someone else's lifeline. The dust had settled on the trial about 6 months earlier, and by settled, I mean the legal system had finished chewing up Bianca and Julian like a wood chipper processing overconfident criminals who thought they were too clever to get caught. Bianca got 8 years federal prison for the financial crimes. plus enough civil restitution orders to keep her broke until roughly the year 2050, assuming she lived that long and managed to find employment that didn't involve stealing from people who trusted her. Julian got 6 years and permanent disbarment from any financial services industry, because apparently helping your girlfriend rob elderly people is the kind of career choice that tends to follow you around like a really persistent stalker. But here's the thing about surviving systematic betrayal by someone who was supposed to love you. The money you get back doesn't actually feel like winning. It feels like evidence of how much was taken from you in the first place. The civil settlement, combined with the whistleblower award from the bank's recovery program and the board-approved compensation package from my company for the stress of having my personal life turn into a federal criminal investigation, added up to enough money to do something meaningful with the wreckage of my previous existence. That's when the idea for Harbor House started taking shape, not as some grand philanthropic gesture, but as the logical evolution of everything I'd learned about financial coercion during my own personal tour through the depths of marital hell. Because it turns out that what happened to me wasn't unique. It was just the version that involved expensive lawyers and surveillance equipment instead of bruises and broken bones. Financial abuse is like domestic violence's sneaky cousin, the one who doesn't leave visible marks but can destroy someone's life just as effectively as any physical attack. That I didn't want headlines or media attention or people telling me what a wonderful person I was for turning my pain into purpose. I just wanted to create a place where people who were getting systematically robbed by the people who were supposed to love them could get help without having to explain why they hadn't figured it out sooner, or why they'd stayed so long, or why they hadn't just left when the first red flags started waving like surrender flags in a hurricane. The concept was simple: a quiet center where anyone escaping financial coercion could get practical help rebuilding their lives. Not therapy, though we'd have referrals for that, but the kind of nuts and bolts assistance that people need when someone has spent years convincing them they're too stupid to handle their own money. Help with opening new bank accounts, understanding credit reports, learning how to spot financial manipulation tactics, and most importantly, figuring out how to trust their own judgment again after years of being told they were paranoid for asking questions about their own finances. Cade designed the security for Harbor House like he was planning the defenses for a fortress, except instead of keeping armies out, he was keeping abusive spouses and manipulative family members from tracking down people who'd finally found the courage to escape. Secure entry systems, discreet routes for people who needed to visit without being seen, and communication protocols that would make it impossible for anyone to use technology to continue their harassment campaigns. Because apparently when you specialize in keeping people safe from other people, you develop some very creative ideas about what safety actually means. Priya built what she modestly called a small forensic clinic, but which was actually a full-service financial investigation unit that could untangle the kind of complex money trails that abusers create to hide assets and confuse their victims. She trained a team of accountants and paralegals to recognize the patterns of financial abuse, to trace money through shell companies and fake businesses, and most importantly, to explain complex financial concepts in language that didn't make people feel stupid for not understanding why their savings account kept mysteriously emptying itself. Sloan structured a free legal triage program that could provide immediate assistance to people who needed protective orders, asset freezes, or emergency hearings to prevent their abusers from completing whatever asset-hiding schemes they'd been working on. She recruited other family law attorneys who specialized in financial abuse cases, creating a network of legal professionals who understood that sometimes the most dangerous person in someone's life was the one who had access to their bank accounts and credit cards. Mrs. Okafor cut the ribbon at our opening ceremony, and watching her hands, steady now, no longer shaking with the fear and confusion that had marked her testimony during the trial, perform that simple ceremonial task felt like witnessing a resurrection. She'd recovered most of her stolen savings through the restitution process, but more importantly, she'd recovered her sense of agency, her belief that she wasn't just a helpless victim of people who were smarter and more sophisticated than she was. The opening day was chaotic in the way that new things always are. People weren't sure where to go or what to ask for. Staff members were still learning the systems, and everyone was operating on nervous energy and caffeine. But by the end of the first week, we'd already helped 12 people open secure bank accounts, filed 4 emergency protective orders, and traced over $200,000 in hidden assets that abusive spouses thought they'd successfully concealed. Some nights, when the building was quiet and the last clients had gone home to apartments or hotel rooms or wherever else they'd found refuge from the people who'd been systematically destroying their lives, I'd stand in the doorway of the main counseling room and listen to the sounds of healing in progress. The soft murmur of someone learning how to reclaim control of their ATM card after years of having every financial transaction monitored and criticized. The relieved laughter that came after a judge signed a protective order that would keep an abusive spouse from accessing joint accounts or using shared credit cards as weapons. The profound silence that settles over someone who's finally safe enough to think clearly about their situation without fear of immediate retaliation that IT still reigns in this city. Because weather doesn't care about your personal character development or your journey from victim to survivor to someone who helps other survivors. But when it does rain, I remember standing under that porch light, soaked and locked out and thinking my life was ending. And I realized that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the doorway to becoming who you were supposed to be all along. Bianca thought that leaving me in the rain would make me smaller, would teach me my place in her hierarchy of importance, would convince me that I was nothing without her guidance and approval. Instead, it became the storm that washed her schemes into daylight, exposed the full scope of her cruelty for a jury to evaluate, and ultimately made room in my life for something that actually mattered. The irony isn't lost on me that the woman who spent years trying to convince me I needed rescuing ended up creating the circumstances that allowed me to become someone who rescues others. Harbor House isn't revenge against Bianca. It's proof that her assessment of my character was just another lie in a catalog of deceptions that stretched back years. Every person who walks through our doors represents another victory over the kind of predatory behavior that almost destroyed me. Another confirmation that people can survive systematic betrayal and build something meaningful from the wreckage. The click of that deadbolt wasn't the sound of my life ending. It was the sound of my real life finally beginning.